Coming up on our last chapter, chapter 38 of Burying the Boys, The CIA, the Mob, and America's Secret History by Daniel Hopsicker. The Killing of Barry Seal. The white unmarked police car carrying Louisiana State Police Lieutenant Robert Thomason, head of a special 21-man narcotics unit tasked solely with stopping Barry Seal, rolled out slowly out of New Orleans in the hazy twilight. After another long day, Thomason was going home. His car inched through traffic into the 24-mile-long causeway across Lake Pontchartrain, which connects New Orleans with its leafy northern suburbs. Though Thomason was tired, fatigue has not dulled his vivid recollections of what happened next. A call crackled over his police radio. 1018, repeat 1018, immediately call headquarters, ordered a grim dispatcher's voice. A cop who had learned a grudging respect for his elusive quarry, Thomason had heard the news in disbelief. What's white and brown and red and rolling around in Baton Rouge? Asked the dispatcher in the mirthless tone cops use to distance themselves from bloody events. Barry Seal. They just gutted him. As he heard the news, in the distance he was still listening to his cruiser's tires rolling over the causeway's grating. Thump, thump, thump. A $500,000 Medellin cartel murder contract had hung over Seal's head, up to a cool $1 million if he was brought alive to Colombia. Still, the chilling, brutal, and clinically efficient with which the renegade agent had been dispatched was breathtaking, especially given that Seal himself was a man with the most impeccable intelligence sources, had not felt threatened. He certainly hadn't availed himself of the federal witness protection program when it was offered to him. The dispatcher asked, "Hey, bud, where you at?" Thump. Middle of the causeway. Thomason replied numbly. "Good," came the curt rejoinder. "Get a bridge ticket on your way back into town, stamped with date and time. See how volatile the whole Seal thing was," says Thomason today, "is that they wanted me to have proof of exactly where I had been when Seal was killed to remove any suspicion that we had played any role in it. It felt much like where you were when Kennedy was shot. It was that big, at least in Louisiana it was, especially since tensions had been running so high since Barry was convicted. In retrospect, Thomason says, the murder was a shock but no surprise. Seal had seemingly fallen from favor with whomever had been protecting him. He'd been on a well-documented downward spiral for over a year, losing status, possessions, and immunity from prosecution he once had taken for granted as a member of the protected class. Even in defeat, Seal's sense of play, almost of camaraderie with the law enforcement people charged with the thankless task of tracking his movements, remained intact, said longtime DEA pilot Dave Chicken Gorman. Chicken had flown B-52s and C-130s in Southeast Asia, then flew out of New Orleans for 17 years. Seal had plied his trade in the same regions. So he had known Barry for a long time, Gorman told us. He recalled running into him one time at Hurlburt Field in Panama City, in the company of civilian Israelis who had left the military and Mossad, supposedly, and we're now supervising training of the PDF, Panama Defense Forces. This was not the first time we'd heard of American involvement with Israeli intelligence in South America drug trade. In the South American drug trade. A former Mossad agent told us that Seal had been running a big operation with their service right up until the time of his death. Chicken Gorman explained the complexity of his relationship with Seal by means of an anecdote which occurred on one of Barry Seal's last days on Earth. Jake Jacobson, Seal's supposed DEA handler, sent me out to confiscate a plane of berries at Ryan Field in Baton Rouge sometime in late '85. And while I'm poking around looking for it, Barry came right over to me. "Chicken, are you looking for my plane?" Barry asked. "Yeah, Barry. I got orders to repossess it, man," I told him. "Well, it's over here," Barry said, and then he took me to it, and it was like no hard feelings, Chicken stated. Barry was like that, a good guy mostly. Dark machinations surrounded the months preceding Seal's assassination. DEA pilot Gorman offered us a glimpse into the players and the intrigue swirling around Seal and the Central American operation. I was working in Belize, out of Ambergway, K, and we had been there for a month, flying ops in the Caribbean, when someone out at the airport decided to squeeze us. They hit us up for a huge bribe to continue operations, so we made a few calls. We heard back from the CIA station chief in Guatemala, who said, "I understand you're having problems. Speak to them. Tell them you talked to me. Everything will be fine." Gorman continues, So I walked over to the tower to this guy's office that had been trying to make us pay, and now this guy is almost weeping with fear, cowering behind his desk saying, "Please don't kill me. Please don't kill me. They told me you would kill me if we didn't leave you alone." Then in late '85, I got another call from the same guy who had fixed things for us earlier, the CIA station head in Guatemala. He told me Barry's wife just flew in. She landed in a private plane in Honduras, then took off and flew to San Jose in Costa Rica, where at this very moment she's depositing $7 million in a bank there. Barry's wife, Debbie, has never been to Costa Rica, so when she heard this, she was understandably curious about this money and drug courier who had been using her name. She pressed Chicken Gorman on the point. "Who was this person in Guatemala who told you this?" "Just a leg," he replied, shrugging. "A field agent, a soldier, nothing more." Piecing the story together took time, but even this small anecdote helped, another tiny piece of the puzzle. From an eyewitness, we heard that several weeks before his murder, Seal was frantically phoning associates, screaming at them to stop two women from boarding a plane to fly to Central America, who were on their way to clean out his offshore bank accounts. One of them, Barbara, was a teenager Cuban drug courier with whom Seal had been carrying on an affair. The other, Teresa, was the daughter of his Colombian associate, Stephen Planta. What had happened? When word got out that Barry Seal's sanction had been removed, it became open season on him and his assets, we were told. The IRS seizure of all his property had been a signal that his assets had become fair game. The feeding frenzy now began. Was Seal's downfall the same as John Gotti's? Arrogance, growing notoriety, a refusal to take a fall, however slight, to protect those higher up in the food chain? Someone who had known Seal all his life, childhood friend John Prevost, had never seen Barry so full of himself, so arrogant, acting like a character out of one of Seal's favorite movies, the Al Pacino remake of Scarface, he said. Prevost watched Barry change in his last desperate months. "I was a Dodge dealer, and Barry bought cars from us regularly, always paying cash, always bringing in just under $10,000. All my managers would stand around and just snicker, you know. Then I remembered seeing him just before he died. He pulled up in a Mercedes, and he was on a high from the $300K ransom business, talking loud, boastful, and he had a gun under his seat. It wasn't the Barry I knew. Seal's assassination had a morality play dimension, Prevost felt. The results of the cocaine epidemic begun to hit home. I had bumped into Barry's ex-wife Linda in a restaurant in Baton Rouge, and she waved, and I went over and said to her, "I've got two boys who are drug dependent. You tell Barry if he's dealing drugs, he needs to die in a flaming car wreck. Little acts of private desperation tell the tale. While briefly in witness protection as he testified in a trial a few months before he died, Seal let a record producer from New York sell him his foolproof formula for playing roulette for the price of the gold Rolex Barry was wearing on his wrist, a sucker bet uncharacteristic for someone whose seeming recklessness had always camouflaged a shrewd capacity to calculate the odds. Seal had been double-crossed, he felt, by the difficulties leading up to sentencing in Baton Rouge. Why did Seal refuse to enter the federal witness protection program, which would have allowed him to assume a new identity in a secret location with help of federal officials? Incredibly, because Barry thought he could walk. His attorney, Louis Ungsby, had argued that U.S. Judge Frank Polozola should follow the lead of a federal judge in Miami who had rewarded Seal for his work as an informant by approving a plea agreement on drug charges, letting him go free without serving time. He was already free of all his Miami legal problems. One need look no further than this for major scandal. The biggest drug dealer in American history, after being caught in multiple jurisdictions, was able, in Miami, to walk. Convictions on multiple serious felonies resulted in nothing more than probation, and even it had now been vacated, he had in fact spent only one night in jail after being convicted of charges for which convicts in every state in the U.S. today are serving life without parole. What's up with that? Had he really just been too valuable an informant, or was Barry Seal just too good an earner to spend more than a day in jail? The answer is in the non-identity in the drug world hierarchy of the pipsqueaks whom Seal was ostensibly sprung from prison to send to jail. None of them were ever a tiny fraction of the threat to society that Seal himself was. Today, the drug dealer Sandinistas are a fading memory, but the drug business is pervasive as ever. Federal Judge Frank Pelosa in Baton Rouge refused to follow the script in Seal's Louisiana sentencing. Instead of giving him time served in his 2 drug felony convictions, there he sentenced Seal to 6 months in a Baton Rouge halfway house. I don't see any reason for coddling him, Pelosa said during the sentencing hearing. In my opinion, people like you ought to be in prison. This begs, of course, the question of how it can be considered coddling to send someone convicted of a major drug class A federal felonies to 6 months in a halfway house. Most people in prison today for drug felonies would take that deal in a heartbeat. But even that was an affront to the arrogant Seal, who, in his defense, has been used to having arrests fixed for him ever since he was a teenager caught flying weapons to Castro in Longview, Texas. The idea of someone as connected as Barry Seal ever going to jail is even today preposterous. Speculation has always centered on who had got to Judge Pelosa. For one deep background intelligence source, we heard that Pelosa had a deep but hidden connection to Bill Casey. Be that as it may, Pelosa didn't do to Seal anything more than the IRS already had. When they seize all of your assets, including children's toys, if you were Seal, when you look at the suddenly empty house around you, you've got an inkling that the good times may be over. They had Judge Pelosa. They'd put the mark of the beast on him, said drug pilot Clarence Harp about the federal judge's inexplicable action of placing Seal in a Salvation Army halfway house. What did that mean? I was trailing Barry at the time he was killed, shadowing him for the agency, just to find out who he was talking to. asked to by Bill Casey, who was a friend of mine, Harp told us. We didn't know how much the outside government knew. I was told not to make contact. You know, Barry had a way of playing both ends against the middle, and he didn't have a whole lot of friends when he died. A former NSA agent who'd done a lot of Bolivian duty told us when Barry was killed, a massive operation in Puerto Rico was closed down at the same time. And $23 million washed up on the beach of this one tiny village which operated right next to this DEA operation, which operated right next to a massive drug smuggling operation with which Barry Seal was associated. The Puerto Rican operation, we heard, was run by another drug smuggling legend pilot, Billy Lane. Lane also trained Contra pilots before they moved on to Mena, Arkansas's portion of their training. In the sure busy for a tiny town of Longview, Texas, where Barry was nabbed by the FBI 30 years earlier and had the arrest straightened out with help from an accommodating local judge. Why, we wondered. Had the DEA situated itself right beside a smuggling operation in Puerto Rico? Our informant smiled. Pilots from the two different operations would see each other every morning at breakfast. A DEA pilot might ask which way you were going. If the smuggler pilot answered south, the DEA guy would say, well, I'll head north then. Just before Seal was murdered, his associate Russ Eakin, E-A-K-I-N, that's a new one, Russ Eakin had been attempting to help Barry transition back into the straight world, he told us. Barry called me the night before he was shot. He wanted out. I already converted, and he wanted to know how he could make the transition too. And that's what I do. I'm very good at moving money around. He wanted to resume a normal life, but as it happened, wasn't able to. I was waiting in a restaurant across the street from him when he was killed, Eakin told us. I saw Barry get killed from the window of the Belmont Hotel coffee shop. The killers were both out of the car, one on either side, but I only saw one shoot 'cause Barry saw it coming and just put his head down on the steering column. Seal's old friend Bill Mao saw Barry Seal for the last time several days before he died. We lived right off Airline Highway where the murder took place. Barry stopped by 2 days before it happened. He said they had him in a box. I told him to pull up a suitcase and give it to Benji, his brother, to hide for future needs. He said he was afraid that would tip off somebody. 2 days later when it happened, it tore me up. I was sick. As long as he could go and come as he pleased, it was okay, Mao continued. Because they weren't about to come to his house to kill him. Before that, he didn't have a schedule, but the judge's order left him with a schedule on the outside to keep from 6 o'clock a.m. to 6 o'clock p.m. There had been others en route to kill Seal at the same time as the hit squad was preparing to swing into action, we discovered. Bill Mao, with a pipeline into the world of the mob, had heard something was coming and then moved to forestall it. I told Barry when I saw him 2 days before he was murdered that I had got word that a certain Chicky Felici out of Pittsburgh was coming down. Chicky was an explosive man. Barry took this to the DEA. They assured him that Chicky had been killed in a gunfight a few years before. But what they didn't know, or I should say pretend they didn't know, Mao continues, is that Chicky had a son that went by the same name, Donald Felici. 24 years old, I heard through the grapevine he was the guy after somebody in Louisiana. It came back that they were going to hit a guy named Seal, so I sent word back to Uncle Sal, said Bill Mao, saying, keep your trash in Pittsburgh. We heard anecdotal evidence that a CIA agent had acted as paymaster for the Seal hit. Colonel Al Caron, who died in 1990, was a CIA paymaster and mafia-connected money launderer who also held the rank of full colonel in Army intelligence. His daughter Dee told us that her father had ever been sent. Whoa, 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 whoa. I gotta start that all over. Colonel Al Caron, who died in 1990, was a CIA paymaster and mafia-connected money launderer who also held the rank of full colonel in Army intelligence. His daughter Dee told us that her father had ever been sent to Dallas to pay off Jack Ruby before the Kennedy assassination. 33 years later, she said, he performed the same function for the SEAL hit. This proved impossible for us to verify, but one military intelligence source who had known SEALs since the 60s admitted that he knew a depressing number of Big Al's confirmed close associates. Big Al had clearly been one of the boys. As Oliver North Bagman, Caron curried large amounts of cash in and out of the country, according to former FAA investigator Rod Stitch. Caron was a member of the Gambino family, had connections to other crime groups in the eastern part of the United States, a member of the military, a CIA operative, and a detective and bagman in the NYPD collecting money that was distributed to captains and inspectors as payoffs for looking the other way where drugs were involved. Like SEALs, Caron's connections covered the waterfront. Most who knew Barry Seal were saddened at his execution, but not surprised. His secretary, Dandra Seal, no relation, was typical. The day Barry was killed, when he came back from lunch, she began, then stopped, her throat catching. See, he knew that day that they were killing him. Yes, he did. Good Lord. And he took it calmly and continued with what he'd been doing, which was trying to get the Playboy channel into the Salvation Army, so that he and the rest of the men could watch it while he was locked up there all night. At night. Not surprisingly, Dandra blames the government for Seal's murder, and not the Medellin cartel tar baby of the official version of events. The CIA people here allowed it to happen. He had a chart. He had dirt on anybody and everybody. Bob Thomason, now a federal drug enforcement official teaching interdiction techniques to state and local police officers, recalled what happened when the state police learned that Barry Seal had been murdered. I immediately put out troops on Baton Rouge. Now keep in mind, we are the state police. The murder jurisdiction was in the city parish. State police go in only when they're called in, all right? Then I put the crime lab on standby. The city cops took one look at Seal's bloody body, realized what they had, and requested the state police at the scene. So I immediately put the New Orleans office on standby, he continued. At that time, we had no idea yet that these guys, the shooters, were like rabbits spreading out in a wildfire. None whatsoever. 35 minutes after the shooting, I had dispatch called the Baton Rouge office of the FBI and the New Orleans office of the FBI to give notification just because it's the right thing to do. You know, we've got a major smuggler murdered, we interrupted him. We discovered that one of the killers actually took pictures of the murder in progress, but the FBI agent who nabbed this guy at New Orleans International Airport as he was trying to flee the country that night exposed the film, rendering it useless as evidence. Thomason chooses his words carefully. What you get when you call the FBI at night, he explains, is a duty agent, okay? He's just a kid, usually, just out of the FBI academy. His standing orders are make no decisions under any circumstances. What you don't get at the time of the night is a seasoned agent or a SAC special agent in charge. You don't get anybody important. So the apprehension at the airport was made by a kid. It went like this. My headquarters called the New Orleans FBI office. As soon as that phone call was received, the two baby agents that had watched that night, they're called watch soups, went out to cover the airport. Now, never in 1,000 years would this ever happen again, but these two lucky guys park their car at the airport and head into the terminal at the exact same time as this shooter, and they've got a physical description over their radio that exactly matches the guy they're seeing. That's the only way that guy got caught. So, if you're asking me, did they deliberately expose that film at the airport? I gotta say, look at who these two FBI guys were. Rookies. These are not the Men in Black. Why was there so much suspicion of the CIA, we asked. From his grimace, we surmise he feels we're pushing. He pauses, straightens his chair, then fixes us with a stare felt before. No doubt my innumerable southern miscreants. Tell me why you're doing this, Thomason demands. From the way he says this, we know exactly what he means. And after we tell him, he sits thinking hard, and then without another word of comment, while staring fixedly out a 12th story window of a hotel room in Daytona Beach, Florida, at the blue-green Atlantic turning now a deeper blue as the sun slowly sets somewhere a million miles away. He starts to talk, and when the words at first come slowly but soon enough are pouring out in torrents. This gets really black, okay? And it gets black for a lot of people. But I'll give you a sequence of events. The FBI appears, shows up, on site at the shooting, okay? And I go, it happens. It's not too fucking extraordinary, but still. And then the contents of the car, the trunk, were seized. But they can't just seize material evidence in a capital crime, we protested. Isn't it illegal for anyone but the investigating officers to remove evidence from a crime scene? I told you, he continued, this gets really black. But some of the contents of the trunk anyway made it to my lab, our Louisiana State Police lab, which is definitely not a mom and pop shop. They've got 60 to 80 highly trained employees. Here's the police procedural. If it's my case and I call the lab, I own the lab, okay? They take orders only from me. It would be the same procedure if a sheriff from Ponduck called. They would then own the lab. The lab would work only for them, understand? Now, it would be beyond a breach of ethics. It would be criminal if, say, I called the lab and said, hey, I hear the city police submitted a report on Joe Schmo. I'm coming to pick it up. It's called tampering with evidence. We're into criminal acts here. The evidence that went into the lab on Barry Seal went to a guy that won't talk to you, so don't ask me for his name or phone number. That has caused a lot of stress in his life. He's a longtime friend and a top gun in forensics, and he gets the contents of Barry Seal's briefcase and some other contents of the car as lab exhibits. As he brings it into the lab, our lab had worked the scene and so had then brought the trunk's contents back to the lab, he continued. We can't help ourselves and blurt out the big question. What was in the trunk of the Cadillac? I'm not trying to be evasive, Thomason answers somberly, but I want to make it very clear. I only have third-hand reports, okay? Seal's trunk contained compelling, and again from third-hand data, very, very compelling documents and tapes. Several briefcase boxes, wherever Seal's Cadillac was, that was where Barry's instant records were. From the way he stressed third hand, we knew he was speaking for the record. Later, we discovered that this man's family dog was decapitated and left floating in their backyard pool as a warning, fully 3 months after Seal's assassination. See, Barry taped his calls. Barry taped all his calls, including all his calls to his controllers. I suspect that were you to have seen the contents of the trunk, it would certainly validate for whom he was employed and what his mission was. Okay? Who has heard those tapes that I could talk to? The tension in the room rises. When he speaks, his voice is soft, barely above a whisper. That's living, he asks. No one. I told you. This gets really black. Barry Seal, who didn't show any nervousness or anxiety about being assassinated by the Medellin cartel, had explicitly denied that he had anything to fear from them. In a television interview with TV reporter John Camp, he shrugged it off. If it's to come, it will come. John Camp is the pseudo-journalist who disgraced himself and his profession by producing an hour-long documentary apologia for Seal called Uncle Sam Wants You. No drug smuggler in history has ever received better publicity. We heard, but were unable to confirm, that the owner of the Baton Rouge station for which Camp produced this PSYOPs piece had been personally asked to help out by a figure who has already played a role in our drama, Democratic National Chairman Charles Manat. Charles Manat put Camp's bosses up to it, emphatically stated this source, who, for this piece of explosive information at least, insisted on strict anonymity. Good doggies get tossed a few bones, and John Camp went from being just another small market TV reporter with a bad toupee to heading a special investigation unit at CNN. Lily Tomlin put it best: no matter how cynical I get, I just can't keep it up. If Seal was right in being unafraid of Medellin cartel retaliation, then who was responsible for his murder? There is no better source of this critical information than 3 Colombians convicted of the killing sentenced to life in prison without parole. We interviewed Richard Sharpenstein, a prominent Miami criminal defense lawyer and a lawyer for one of the 3 convicted assassins, who casually revealed the explosive truth about who ordered Barry Seal killed and why. I represented Miguel Velez for the Barry Seal homicide, which was one of the most incredible experiences I've ever had been through, Sharpenstein began. It was an amazing experience. Nobody wanted to think about what any of this meant back in 1986. The implications were just too big, and I'm only speaking with you now because some of this has leaked out. All 3 of the Colombians went on trial, always told us, their lawyers, that they were being directed after they got into this country on what to do and where to go by an anonymous gringo, a United States military officer who they quickly figured out was Oliver North, Sharpenstein says. Say that again, we asked. We were sure we'd heard it right the first time. We just needed confirmation. Once they rendezvoused together in the States, they explained, Sharpenstein, the Colombians, were being directed by phone by a man who insisted on remaining anonymous, but who did identify himself as being an officer in an American military. They were put in touch with this officer through Rafa, a Colombian smuggler, who was the guy my client worked for, and they all believed it was Oliver North. What corroborative indications are there to justify the charge of murder against Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North? North, numerous sources stated without prompting, had been running an assassination squad right out of his White House office, so this extrajudicial execution of Barry Seal wouldn't have made him blink an eye. There are even allegations that he had been tasked with drawing up plans to suspend the U.S. Constitution and declare martial law in the event the massive drug smuggling taking place ever came to public light. In Guts and Glory, The Rise and Fall of Oliver North, author Ben Bradley, Jr., writes, North's work for FEMA from 1982 to the spring of 1984 was highly classified and some would say bizarre. He was involved in helping to draft a sweeping contingency plan to impose martial law in the event of nuclear war or less serious national crises, such as widespread internal dissident or opposition to an American military invasion abroad. COG, continuity of government. Look it up. It's pretty fucked up. But the popular mythology of Seal's assassination is not just wrong, but active disinformation. When we began to examine Seal's assassination more closely, we saw that even basic facts like how many killers there were was stated wrong to slant the story. In the official version of events recounted in newspapers, the killers were always described as a three-man hit team of Columbia nationals. Even a cursory reading of the headlines revealed, to our amazement, hadn't been 3 men involved. There had been 8. 3 men may be a hit team, 8 is a hit squad. So this is clearly active disinformation. Even newspaper reporters can count to 10 unaided. 6 men had been arrested at various stages of attempting to flee the scene. A 7th, Rafa Cardona, who had dispatched the team, was safely ensconced in Colombia, at least for a while. He was charged in absentia for planning the hit, but was himself mowed down in a spray of automatic gunfire inside his antique car dealership in Colombia later that year. Then there was the 8-man Miami CIA asset Joe Cowton, who had supplied the machine gun. More on him in a moment. Richard Sharpenstein's client, Miguel Velez, a.k.a. Kumbamba, has been described as a CIA hitman in the New York press, where he was wanted for murder. It was a total flunky that he was caught. He was done in by a deer. Earlier, Vasquez... What? Okay. Hold on. I gotta start this page in the next video, because I gotta eat.